A man finishes a slice of pie at the counter of a dying diner off a 2-lane highway in western Pennsylvania at 1:15 in the morning, and he leaves the way he came in, quietly, without a fuss, a few bills on the counter for a $4 pie. Nobody sees him go. The waitress is in the back. The cook is on dishes. The owner is in the office staring at a number on a piece of paper that has decided to ruin his life. The little bell over the door barely makes a sound. But before he goes, the man does one thing that nobody sees either. He takes a plain white envelope out of his jacket and he slides it under the rubber mat beside the register, where the waitress will find it when she cashes out at the end of her shift. And not 1 second before. He walks out into the cold. A motorcycle starts somewhere in the dark. And then, he is gone. A stranger no one will be able to describe to the police or the papers. A man who was there for 1 hour and left no trace except an envelope under a mat. That envelope held a note and more money than anyone in the diner had ever held in their hands. And in the next 6 months it would save a man's life, send a kid to a future he'd given up on, and turn a diner that was 3 weeks from going dark into something nobody on Route 9 had words for. Nobody noticed him leave. But what he left set everything in motion. This is the story of that envelope, and of Frank Sokol, who had quietly decided to give up on everything, and who had no idea that the tired stranger at his counter had been listening to every word. Stay with me. What was actually in the envelope is not the part that matters. The part that matters is who he trusted to open it. There is a diner on Route 9 outside a town called Renslow, in the part of Pennsylvania the highways forgot. It's called the Bluebird, and it has been called the Bluebird since 1962, when a Polish immigrant named Stefan Sokol put up the neon and started serving eggs to the men coming off the night shift at the mill. The mill closed in 1991. The interstate took the through traffic in 1998. The town lost half its people over 30 years, one moving truck at a time. And through all of it, somehow the Bluebird stayed open. A long Formica counter, a row of red vinyl stools worn pale in the middle, a pie case that still turned, and a neon bluebird in the window that flickered on every night at dusk like a small, stubborn act of faith. By last winter, the Bluebird was the only thing still lit on that whole stretch of Route 9 after midnight, which made it, for the people who had nowhere warm to be at 1 in the morning, the closest thing to a church the county had left. On the night this happened, it was 11 degrees and snowing, the fine dry snow that means it's too cold to snow properly. Inside, the Bluebird held exactly 4 souls. Don Kowalski was behind the counter, 52 years old, 22 of them spent on the rubber mat behind that register, refilling coffee and remembering everyone's order and holding the whole place together with a kind of tired grace that nobody had ever once thanked her for. Marcus Bell was on the dishes, 19, a paramedic textbook propped open against the sprayer, flashcards in his apron pocket, studying in 90-second bursts between racks of plates. Walt Pearson was on his usual stool at the end, 78 years old, a widower of 4 years, nursing the bottomless coffee Dawn never charged him for, because the Bluebird at midnight was warmer than his empty house and a great deal less quiet. And around midnight, a 5th soul came in out of the cold. A man in his 50s, snow in his graying hair, in a battered riding jacket, who took the stool 3 down from Walt and ordered coffee and, after a while, a slice of the cherry pie. He didn't talk much. He was the kind of customer Dawn liked. Easy, quiet, tipped before he'd been served. He sat at the counter of the Bluebird for an hour, and he watched, and he listened, the way a man listens when he has spent a lot of his life in rooms full of people and has learned that the truest things get said quietly, late. To strangers. His name was Cole Hartley, and the owner of the Bluebird, in the office in the back, did not know he was there, and would not have cared if he had, because Frank Sokol had decided, that very afternoon, to close the diner for good and walk away from the only thing his father had ever left him. Frank Sokol was 63 years old, and to understand the envelope you have to understand the number on the piece of paper in his office. He had taken over the Bluebird when his father died, 18 years before, and he had spent every one of those 18 years losing a slow war against arithmetic. The town kept shrinking. The costs kept climbing. He'd remortgaged the house. He'd skipped his own pay more months than he'd taken it. He'd held on past the point where holding on made any sense, because letting go meant being the Sokol who let his father's diner die, and Frank could not bear to be that man. But that afternoon the linen company had moved him to cash only, and the bank had left the message he'd been dreading, and Frank Sokol had sat down with a pencil and done the math one final time, and the math had said what it had been threatening to say for years. There was no version of the next 3 weeks where the Bluebird stayed open. It was over. He'd known it was over for a long time. Now he had the number to prove it. And sitting alone in that office, with the number in front of him, Frank Sokol had gone somewhere darker than he'd ever told anyone he'd been. Not just the diner is finished. Something underneath that. I am finished. I am a 63-year-old man who lost his father's place and his own house and has nothing to show for a whole life of trying, and I don't know what I'm for anymore. He had been sitting with that thought for hours, the way you sit with a thought when there's no one in your life close enough to interrupt it. His wife had passed. His kids had moved to where the jobs were and called on Sundays. There was no one to tell. There was just the number, and the empty office, and a man who had quietly run out of road. That was the man in the back office while a stranger ate cherry pie at his counter. Not a cruel man, not a villain, just a defeated one, alone with the worst version of the story, the way far too many good people end up alone with it. Around midnight, for no reason he could name, Frank came out of the office to get a coffee. And the stranger at the counter looked up at him, just looked, the way that man looked at things, and said, "Long night?" And Frank Sokol, who had not told a single living person what he was carrying, sat down on a stool next to a man he'd never met. Because sometimes the only person you can tell is the one you'll never see again. He didn't mean to say much. He said all of it. It came out the way these things come out at 1 a.m. to a stranger, the mill, his father, the neon Bluebird, 18 years of losing, the remortgaged house, the number on the paper, the kids in other cities, the wife in the ground. He told the stranger he was closing. He told him he hadn't told Dawn yet, or Marcus, or old Walt, because he couldn't stand to watch their faces. And then, quieter, looking into his coffee, he told him the other part. The part underneath. That he didn't know what a man like him was for, once the one thing he'd been holding on to was gone. The stranger listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush in with the things people rush in with. He let Frank get all the way to the end of it, and then he was quiet for a moment. And then he said something Frank Sokol would turn over in his mind for the rest of his life. "Can I tell you what I've been watching for the last hour?" the stranger said. "While you were back there with that number," he nodded down the counter, at Dawn refilling Walt's cup without being asked, at the slice of pie she'd slid in front of the old man that wasn't on any check. "That woman has kept an old man company every night for 4 years, so he doesn't have to be alone in the dark. That kid on the dishes is studying to be a paramedic between plates because this job lets him, and he's going to spend his life pulling people out of the worst minutes of theirs. And that old fella comes here every night because this is the one place left that's warm and has a human being in it who knows his name. He turned to Frank. You think you don't know what you're for. Frank, you built the only lit room for 20 miles where lonely people aren't lonely. You think that's nothing? You think the arithmetic measures that? Frank's throat had closed up. I had a stretch once, the stranger said, where I'd lost about everything that I thought made me me. I won't bore you with it. But I'll tell you the thing that turned it. It wasn't somebody fixing my problem. Nobody could fix it. It was one person, a stranger basically, looking at me on the worst night and acting like I was still worth something. That's all it was. That's all it ever is. He set down his coffee. The number on your paper is real. I'm not going to insult you and say it isn't. But it's not the only true thing in this building tonight. Don't let it be the one you believe. He didn't say anything grand after that. He finished his pie. He and Frank talked a while longer about smaller things, motorcycles, the cold, the cherry pie, which the stranger said was the best he'd had in years and meant it. And then Frank went to help Marcus close down the grill, and when he looked back up, the stool 3 down from Walt was empty, and there were a few bills folded under the coffee cup, and the little bell over the door had already gone still. Nobody noticed him leave. Dawn found the envelope at 2:40 in the morning, cashing out the register, when she lifted the rubber mat to count what was under it the way she did every night. It was a plain white envelope, unsealed, and it was thick in a way that made her stop breathing for a second. She opened it at the counter with Marcus and Walt watching, and inside was a folded note and a band of $100 bills so thick she had to set it down on the formica, because her hands wouldn't hold it steady. Later, when they counted it, it would come to $40,000. But Dawn didn't count it then. She read the note first, in handwriting none of them recognized, and then she read it out loud. Because some things you cannot read alone. I sat at this counter for an hour tonight and watched some of the best people I've seen in a long time keep a warm light on for each other in the cold. I don't have the words for what that's worth, so I'm leaving this instead. It's for the bluebird, and for the people who keep it alive. The waitress who feeds the lonely man. The kid with the textbook, the old man who shouldn't have to drink his coffee alone, and the owner, who I think forgot tonight what he's actually for. I'm not going to tell you how to spend it. You already know who at this counter needs what. I watched you all night. You're better at knowing than I'd be. Just don't let the good ones give up. Pass it on when you can. Somebody did it for me once, and it's the only reason I'm still here to do it for you. Keep the light on. A stranger who needed a place like this once Dawn Kowalski put the note down on the counter and pressed both hands over her mouth. And Marcus Bell, 19 years old, sat down hard on a stool, and old Walt Pearson, who had not cried since his wife's funeral, took his glasses off and wiped his eyes with a paper napkin from the dispenser. And Frank Sokol came out of the back, drawn by the silence, and read the note over Dawn's shoulder. And the man who 4 hours earlier had run out of road stood in his father's diner at 3 in the morning and wept, because a stranger he'd told he didn't know what he was for had looked at him and his people and decided they were worth $40,000 and a promise. Don't let the good ones give up. He understood, reading it, that the stranger had heard the part underneath, and that he had answered it. Here's the part that matters. The $40,000 was the easy part. The money was never going to be the part that mattered. What mattered was that the note didn't say, "Here, I fixed it." It said, "You already know who needs what. Pass it on." It didn't hand Frank Sokol a rescue. It handed him a job. And a man who had forgotten what he was for now had, in his hands, A stranger's stubborn insistence that he was for exactly this, deciding with care how to keep a warm light on for the people around him. Frank could have just paid the linen bill and the bank and called it survival. He didn't. He sat down with Dawn at the counter as the sun came up, and they did what the note asked. They did it like it was sacred. Because it was. They cleared the debt that would have closed the doors, enough to buy a year. A real year. And Frank used that year to do the thing he'd been too defeated to try, which was to stop running the Bluebird like a dying business and start running it like the only lit room for 20 miles. Which is what it was. He opened it round the clock for the night shift folks at the new distribution center 2 exits down, the one he'd been too beaten to go court for their business. He started a thing on a corkboard by the register, a row of paper coffee cups pinned up, paid forward, so that anyone who came in cold and broke could take a coffee and a bowl of soup that a stranger had already covered. He called it Stefan's board after his father. And the rest of the envelope, the part the note had trusted him to place, Frank placed exactly where a stranger at a counter had pointed. He paid for Marcus Bell's paramedic certification, the exam fee and the textbooks, and the gap in his hours so the kid could study. The whole thing. No loan. Just go. He fixed Dawn Kowalski's dead car, the one she'd been catching rides around, and when he found out she was 3 months behind on her own rent and had never said a word in 22 years, he fixed that too, and gave her a raise the new business could finally support, and made her the manager, which she'd been in everything but title and pay since the Clinton administration. And he started driving old Walt Pearson home himself on the cold nights, and then started having Walt over for Sunday dinner, 2 widowers and a card table, because the note had reminded him that nobody should have to drink their coffee alone, including, it turned out, Frank, 1 envelope. 1 hour at a counter. Everything in motion. The chain didn't stop at the Bluebird. That's the thing about the kind of grace that comes with instructions to pass it on. It doesn't pool, it runs. Marcus Bell passed his exam that spring and became a paramedic, and he is one right now, tonight, somewhere out on those dark county roads, pulling people out of the worst minutes of their lives, exactly like the stranger said he would. 2 years in, on a winter call on Route 9, he ran a code on a 79-year-old man in cardiac arrest and brought him back. And it was old Walt Pearson. And Marcus rode in the back of that ambulance, holding the hand of the man he'd watched drink free coffee at the Bluebird when they were both just regulars at a counter. And Walt is still here because a kid got to finish school because of an envelope. You cannot make that up. It just happens when you set a thing in motion. Dawn Kowalski runs the Bluebird now. Frank made her a partner the 3rd year, then handed her the keys when his knees finally quit. And she runs it the way she always ran her station, like every person who comes through the door is somebody. Stefan's board is still by the register. It's never empty. The town figured out, the way small towns do, that you pin a cup up there when you've had a good week, so it's waiting for somebody who's having a bad one. Dawn says some weeks the board pays out more coffee than the register does, and she says it like it's the proudest number she's ever run. And Frank Sokol lived. I want to be plain about that, because of where he was that night. The man who sat alone with a number and ran out of road got handed, by a stranger who'd heard the part underneath, a reason to still be for something. He spent the rest of his good years being it. He kept the light on. The neon Bluebird still flickers on every dusk on that dark stretch of Route 9. A small, stubborn act of faith, and most of the people who see it have no idea that it was 3 weeks from going dark forever, or that it stayed lit because a tired man on a motorcycle stopped for pie one cold night and listened. Nobody ever did figure out who he was. There were guesses, later, when a version of the story got around. Dawn keeps the note framed behind the register. She's read it 10,000 times. She says the line she comes back to isn't the part about the money, it's the last part. Somebody did it for me once, and it's the only reason I'm still here. She says that's the whole thing, right there. That none of us keep our own light on. Somebody, somewhere back down the line, kept it on for us. And the rent on that is, we keep it on for the next one. I've told a lot of these stories on this channel. This is the one I keep coming back to lately, and it's not because of the envelope, and it's not because of the $40,000. It's because of Frank. It would be easy to skip past Frank. He's not a villain. There's no cruelty to be outraged at. But I think he's the most important person in this story. And here's why. Because the danger in Frank's life that night wasn't a cruel man or a greedy landlord. It was a quieter thing, and a more common one. It was a good person, alone, at the end of his rope, sitting with the worst version of his own story because there was no one close enough to interrupt it. And I think there are a lot more Franks out there than there are villains. I think most of the real danger in most people's lives isn't somebody doing something cruel to them. It's them, alone, at 1 a.m, with a number and no one to tell. What the stranger did wasn't pay a bill. Anybody with the money could pay a bill. What he did was sit down next to a defeated man and act like he was still worth something. And then, trust him. Trust him, with an envelope and a job, to be the person he'd forgotten he was. That's the part I can't get past. He didn't rescue Frank. He reminded Frank what he was for, and then got out of the way and let him be it. I don't know if I'd have noticed Frank that night. I'd like to think I'd have caught the look on a man's face and sat down on the next stool. But honestly, I'd probably have eaten my pie and ridden off into the warm idea of myself, the way most of us do. And maybe that's the thing I keep turning over. The next defeated person at the next quiet counter. You don't need $40,000. You need a stool next to theirs, and the willingness to act like they're still worth something. That's free. That's the part the stranger said was the only part that ever mattered. He was right. This story is fictional, inspired by the kind of person we'd all like to believe stops for pie sometimes. The one who hears the part underneath and answers it. If something in it landed for you, drop a comment and tell me about a time somebody kept your light on, or a stranger you wish you'd sat down next to. I read them, and the quiet ones say the most. If you know a Frank, somebody good who's gone quiet and might be sitting alone with a number tonight, share it with them. Or better yet, go sit down next to them. It might be the thing that sets everything in motion. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. There's another one coming, and I think you'll want to be here for it. See you in the next one.